Welcome to the True Images podcast. I'm here with Ivan Amargo, John Wolfe, and Jason McDowell. And I'm Carly Cleveland, and this is our very first episode. We're very excited to be here and to start. And we're just going to give our little bios and introduce ourselves before we get started.
Hello, I'm Ivan Amargo, and I am excited to be here. I was born in Washington, D.C., grew up in San Diego, and I moved here when I was 20. I have one wife and 3 kids, and now a dog. I pastor a local church in town here in St. George, Utah called Redeemer Community, and I also teach a makerspace and design class at a local charter school in the area as well. And I'm just excited. This is our first time. We're all together. Hello.
I'll jump right in. My name is Dr. John Wolfe. I am a professor of philosophy at the local institution here in St. George. I've been here for almost 12 years. My research interests include ancient medieval philosophy, particularly the work of Augustine of Hippo. I'm also interested in ethics when it comes to university life, the ethics surrounding returning veterans, especially those from active duty, and also philosophy of disability. And so I'm going to be the sort of wet rag, Debbie Downer as a lot of this discussion. So,
and I'm Jason McDowell. I've been in the area for about 25 years. Currently, I'm a pastor at a church called Mountain View, and it's a non-denominational church in the area. I've been there for about 10 years. Before that, I spent 14 years as a youth pastor. Grew up in the Midwest and then moved out to Utah, like I said, a while back. And so excited about being a part of things here, and excited about Real Truth Ministries and the impact that has made already on our church community and on us as parents and as a family as well. I have a wife and 4 kids, and so appreciate that.
And by the way, the area we live in is southern Utah right now. That's our neck of the woods. I'm Carly Cleveland. I'm the director of the Real Truth Ministries. We're a local organization here in southern Utah, and we provide different trainings and resources and tools for parents, leaders, pastors, and people in our community to help help equip them to properly care for survivors of abuse. And we do proactive trainings and try to give people the proactive tools and resources to fight against abuse. And also, I'm the author of True Images, so that's our podcast and why we're here today. And also, I wanted to ask you guys, what would your alternate career be if you weren't pastors or teachers?
Oh, man.
Like your dream life, or if you, maybe this is a different question, but if you got canceled and you had to move away and do just like a whole different thing, run away somewhere.
I know, real fast.
So
world we're in.
I'll say that from the very, I can't imagine my life anything else than what I am. Like from the veriest young age, I remember being in 2nd grade saying that I always wanted to be a doctor. And then I found out you had to deal with blood, and so I didn't want to be that kind of doctor. I have always seen myself as a teacher, that I feel fulfilled and energetic whenever I have the opportunity to teach. And so the idea of what would you do differently or what kind of other option would you have, like that's changing who I am, which is kind of weird whenever we talk about the idea of our work defining us, but it's not just in the classroom, it's the relationships that we have with everybody. And so I think that I don't see myself anything other than an educator, regardless of whether that's a place where I'm getting paid to do so or not being paid to do so.
Oh, man. I am kind of a dreamer. I like thinking about that. I think part of it is I'm kind of nerdy. Like I do like multiverse stories, and there's a lot of popular pop culture right now that's about the multiverse. And I was talking to my wife about that. Like, what would I be doing? Quick version. I think I would have loved to be a bass player in a band and like play music. Like I love playing music. There's times I wish I would be playing that. Long story. My life diverged with a car accident. We might talk about that later on in the future. But I stole my parents' car, crashed it. This is a real story. And that day before I made it on this worship team, on this band. And the next day I crashed my parents' car, and they were like, you can't go to that school anymore. And that opportunity of joining that band closed down. And some of those people are playing with Jeremy Camp and Phil Wickham and some other fun things. I was like, that could have been me. And then I always think of me being Uncle Rico, like, if they just put me in the last quarter. But I always wanted to be a teacher, actually. From 9th grade, I was like, yeah. And when I transitioned out of the church that I was at for 16 years, I was like, yeah, I think I want to do teaching. And the Lord opened that door up. Like, literally, it was that week that I transitioned from that one job. They offered me a job at the school to be a librarian. And so, yeah, I think a musician, though. Play music.
That sounds terribly exciting compared to what I'm probably about to say. But so as far as me, I think what John expressed is kind of my heart too. It would be hard for me to see myself doing anything else. But a lot of the defining moments for me were around 20 years old that headed me into the direction career-wise. And so I'm going to go back and wind the clock back before that point in time. And one of the things that I actually considered was becoming a pilot.
Nice.
Either maybe like a missionary pilot, like a bush pilot, or a commercial airline pilot, or a military pilot. And so that was one of the things that I had. Another thing was, while I was in college, I had kind of a wild hair thought maybe I should double major. And then I counted the classes that would differ from my current or the course that I was in, and I thought, that's probably a bad idea. But I also I thought about double majoring in English. And so it's possible that I could be an English teacher or an editor or something like that. But it wasn't meant to be. So here I am.
I don't know. I had so many different things as a young person. I wanted to be an archaeologist for a long time.
Nice.
That went out the window early when I learned about the school commitment. And then I guess maybe if I had a different career, I actually went to school to be a wedding planner, which I really love to plan a party. I would still like to do that. But I think if I had to run, if I was canceled and I had to run away, I would want to go to an island and work at a coffee shop where no one, you kind of are inconspicuous and you just are making coffee and just rolling with but somewhere where you don't have to wear shoes, Hawaii or something.
Paradise Coffee Co.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Mason's
sounds great.
dream is Mason, our producer, who's also my husband, his dream is to open a coffee cart somewhere, just pretty much anywhere. I mean, an island would be ideal, but
If you do, I will come. Tell me.
That would be awesome.
First customer, already there. We had so many ideas, but it's also when you're trying to financially plan for the future, starting a restaurant in a truck is kind of not a great secure move for the future. So we've had to redirect on some of those dreams. But I feel like if all of you are saying you are doing what you always wanted to do, I mean, you're on the right course. Good for you.
I'm just not interesting. I think that's how it boils down to.
One thing on that track that I've appreciated that actually John is a friend of mine, has been a friend for years, and one thing that he kind of spoke into my life was you should always be kind of reevaluating. And so I think there are these different points of time in our lives where we may end up changing paths, maybe not who we are or what we do significantly, but just the direction of it. And so, that's something that I've been encouraged to do and am actually kind of in the middle of doing currently. But I think you never know. Maybe there'll be a season of life where you have that coffee cart on some island, and maybe not. Maybe there's something we've never even thought of where one of us will be, headed toward. So I think that's valuable advice too.
I actually also went to school. Maybe my life is just a story of being all over the world, but I was going to school for fashion and business to be a stylist. And then Mason He's okay now. The end of story is Mason's good, but he had cancer right when I was doing finals. He went to the hospital, so that derailed it. But that actually is when the year we started RTM and
Oh, wow.
started working on actually like the very, very first version of this book. So you just never know how things are gonna pan out. But one of the things that we're talking about today is one of the interests that you had, John, about the theology and philosophy of disability. So we're going to listen to an interview with John and Cameron Horner, who will introduce, and you'll see in this interview. And it's a fantastic, wonderful conversation. And we'll listen and come back and discuss.
So, Cameron, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it. For those, because we are in an auditory podcast sort of format, and then we're not going to be able to see our lovely faces as we go through this. Maybe it would be a good idea to start out with who you are, what your ministry is, and what led you to the path that you have right now.
Yeah, well, my name's Cameron Horner. John, thank you for doing this interview. I'm super excited to be on. But my name's Cameron Horner. I am a 32-year-old, married to my lovely wife, Annie Horner. We are newly married, so I sometimes still accidentally use her maiden name, but Annie Beckstrand Horner. We currently live in Portland, Oregon. However, I was born and raised in North Carolina. You'll probably pick up on the accent. But we moved here actually only about a month ago. And I'm playing wheelchair rugby here and in school here and doing ministry here. And yeah, it's been a cool change. But yeah, so if you being an auditory podcast, though honestly it's not on video either, I am actually a wheelchair user. Have been in a wheelchair since I was 18 years old, so it's 14 years now, a little over 14 years. And my upbringing was very Christian. So I grew up in a Christian home, Southern Baptist country boy, kind of all the standard stuff. Yeah, like the quintessential. You see the movie with the Southern Baptist Church. That was us.
Yeah.
And love the Bible. Had really powerful experience with God at a young age. But felt a call into ministry. Actually, yeah, there's so much more to this, but felt a call into ministry when I was really 18 years old after a profound spiritual awakening in my life. But then when I was 18 years old, before going off to Bible college, I was in a diving accident into shallow water while on family vacation. And really, God, in the year prior to that moment, had created this awakening and revival in my heart that would be really hard to exaggerate, to be honest. And like I mentioned, felt the call to ministry. Uh, then when this injury happened, on the day of the injury, it was really profound, the things that God did. One, when I dove into shallow water, broke my neck, became immediately paralyzed, but didn't go unconscious, didn't pass out. I was just under the water, couldn't move and couldn't swim back up. So I had to totally rely on God in that moment, began to pray, felt the peace of God come over me. Uh, Amid also the emotions of fear and what's going on and trying to figure out my circumstances. But I had the peace of God meet me under the water. And then after about probably close to a minute, if not a minute, I kind of ran out of air. I was holding my breath for so long. But then when I did the kind of gasp in thing and the little hiccup, I saw bubbles and cannot explain it other than I just miraculously had more air. It was like God just gave me a half breath or a quarter breath to hang on a little bit longer. And it was this miraculous moment in my life that really has marked me. Really the whole thing has, but that moment in particular, and I told people about it later when I was able to finally speak about it. But I was still under the water even after that. And maybe 15 seconds later, my lifeguard friend appeared right beside me and supported my head and pulled me up and pulled me back to shore. And I just started quoting scripture because that was the thing that the Lord had put on my heart for the year leading up to this moment. I mean, He was preparing me in so many ways for this moment. So, um, anyway, I was pulled to shore, quoting scripture. The presence of God was there. Um, we we're in this moment of trying to figure out what's wrong with Cameron, what's going on, and we slowly pieced together that broke my neck. The paramedics came, took me to the hospital, and they put me back together through two surgeries, 18 hours of surgery in total. But in that hospital room after surgery, the initial ICU room, it would be hard to express really the presence of God that met us there. It's really a profound story of really God's grace. And because of what he did in the moment of that injury, meeting me with the water, saving my life, my friend finding me at the very last second. I mean, I couldn't have held on any longer. That story, this profound God story, kind of did like a little mini revival in my hometown and then in my state, and began getting phone calls to come and share my story places. And, I felt this call to ministry when I was 18, but had no idea and would have never signed up for it in the way that ended up happening, where now I'm going from a wheelchair uh, at 18 years old to different places telling my story of God saving me and God meeting me by his grace and the joy that we had after this injury. And the joy was there because God's presence was there and God was working immediately in our life and using the testimony of what happened that day to change people's lives. So we really got to experience this profound joy. But that was kind of the initial years of getting to share the story. I also love to preach the Bible, and we started a nonprofit because of doing ministry, just to kind of fund what I was doing and help people along the way. But what has slowly birthed out of that is something I actually avoided for many years, and we can talk about that. But what has birthed out of that in the past 5, 6 years is more of a disability ministry. So, an advocacy for people with disabilities, specifically for helping churches become places of belonging and inclusion for people with disabilities. And those two words, belonging and inclusion, we can talk about those at some point if you want to. But we are actually, so the nonprofit began as Cameron Horner Ministries. It was more named for me than anything. And we have had various websites over the years, and I've had you know videos of my story, and I've traveled around telling that story, and it's really been a powerful experience doing that. However, we have felt a call to do kind of a rebrand and name change, and this will actually help to explain what we do now. We are renaming the ministry to Accessible Grace. And those two words are key for us because the word access is a big word within disability advocacy. It has a broad definition, as you know, John. But then grace is also a nod to the fact that this is and always will be a Christian Bible-based ministry where we're sharing the grace of God, and the grace of God wants to meet people where they're at in disability and able-bodied. But what Accessible Grace, the emphasis will be is holistic care for people with disabilities. One of the things I'm passionate about is the local church being a space of belonging for people with disabilities, and belonging. To get to that place, you have to tear down barriers of access. And so we want to come alongside churches to recreate cultures and spaces that will be homes of belonging for people with disabilities in their community. A lot of times that starts with a culture shift. So maybe I come, or someone in their community comes to share about their testimony or their experience, and then we want to be a resource that comes alongside for the longer term to help a church with the individual or personal or structural changes that they have to make to become more accessible for people with disabilities. Then what we also want to do is come alongside individuals with disabilities to offer pastoral care or financial support to recreate spaces or make amenity changes to their homes or spaces that they live, to be able to offer aid there. So that's just a little bit about what we do. Some of this is still kind of in the birthing process, but the one thing that I definitely do is travel and speak on disability or preach on the word or share my story. So there you go.
Well, thank you, Cameron. Again, I'm smiling throughout. Again, I wish this was a visual sort of medium because you can see me nodding and smiling as much as I
Hmm.
can nod throughout because your background of that sort of background and upbringing mirrors my own. I grew
Okay.
up in a rural Baptist community. I'm the only non-pastor in my family, and
Okay.
so Again, that's the sort of lived experience. But you mentioned a couple of things, and I'm just sort of wanting to draw that into some other points. You mentioned this sort of cultural shift, and I think that one of the things when we talk about making substantial changes, we have to talk about you can't make a change unless you know that there's a problem.
Yes.
And when I was preparing for our discussion, one of the things that I noticed was something that really hit close to home to me, which was you talking about in a video on your website where you were talking about your experiences going and trying to speak at the churches like you described that you were doing.
Yep.
And you said that, a lot of the churches that you have participated in and spoke at are do not have accessibility ramps. In fact, they're trying to get up to the podium to speak is a challenge in many of the places. In the video that I watched, you said you could count on one or two hands the number of times that you've had an accessibility
Absolutely.
ramp. And so,
Yep.
one of the ways that for somebody who also has some physical limitations, I noticed that when I start teaching, so I'm a college professor, that when I start teaching, I begin all of my classes the same way, which is sort of explaining the physical limitations that I'm going to be
Mm.
having. And the way that you sort of addressed that elephant in the room was you talked about, sort of when you had to, whenever the church had a deficiency and you had to be carried physically to the podium to be able to speak, you made you tried to lighten the mood and sort
Yep.
of get over the awkwardness by making a joke about this being a real test of faith to you trusting the person carrying you.
That's right.
But then you said something that and this is what really stuck with me and I really appreciated. You said that you don't make that joke anymore. And I think I'd like to hear maybe a little bit more about that, and especially in light of maybe this is a moment where the first introduction as you begin to speak gives the church a sort of mirror to reflect. So I guess the general question is, why don't you make that joke anymore?
Yeah, well, the joke comes from the general felt awkwardness that I think everyone feels in the moment. And how do you break awkwardness? Sometimes it's with a bit of levity.
Mhm.
So that's where the joke comes from. Probably the reason that I don't make the joke anymore, there's probably a couple reasons, but one is maybe just a bit of fatigue and exhaustion around the whole situation. And I'm not one that gets like up in arms about when someone is not giving justice to me. That's just not my personality. But you do eventually, when you've been to so many places, you do eventually kind of get an exhaustion when you're like, I've been talking about this for so long, I've experienced this for so long, and the has been deficient in this for so long that it's just not funny to me anymore.
Right.
you know so that's probably part of it. I think it's a serious matter that really needs to be addressed, and maybe instead of making the joke, though, maybe I don't know, maybe there's still room for that. It could actually be a point to graciously point out, okay, everyone, you see what had to happen here. A great change that could be made is if we were able to find some kind of accommodation, even if it's a portable ramp. Because I look, I grew up, like I mentioned, Southern Baptist. I know some of those places are not going to be able to have a ramp fit in there anywhere, but there are great options that churches can purchase, portable ramps. I have some in the back of my car. You could pop some of those onto a stage easily. And
Yep.
even like I'm kind of a lightweight. I'm 135 pounds. My wheelchair weighs 30 pounds. A couple guys in the congregation can carry me up. Even if that's possible, what happens in a situation like that is that the dignity of the person is brought a little bit lower. Even if the congregation isn't thinking that way, the person experiences it that way. And so what you're doing by offering the ramp is you're offering a moment of dignity to the person, where we're saying, we care about you, we care about your mobility, and we want you to be able to be a leader in this capacity. And we want it to be in a dignifying way.
A phrase that you used a couple of different times that maybe tied into this is you mentioned belonging and inclusion. And, the
Yep.
dangers about having any sort of public conversation is that we are aware of how words can gain baggage. And especially in this sort of
Yep.
larger national climate, those words may not be fully understood. And so,
Yeah.
from a standpoint of your work and your ministry, what do you understand belonging and inclusion to mean? How does it relate to Christianity as a whole? And why is it vital to our work with other Christians?
Yeah. Well, you're right. Words get so politicized, and that's so unfortunate. If we could just all take a breath and depoliticize any of the words, neither of us are trying to make a political statement here.
Right.
The word inclusion is often used by those who want to make changes and want to make their spaces more inclusive for people with disabilities or really for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if we can depoliticize that, we're just talking about the ability to make your space open and welcoming for the whole range of audience that you want to invite. So, I don't think any church out there, any at least halfway decent church out there, is trying to keep people from coming to their churches. Now, of course, those places exist, but anyway, most places aren't that way. So what you want to be able to do is include as many people as you can so that they can hear the gospel and Jesus, um, experience Jesus' love. That's all we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good impulse, right? Like to be able to include people with disabilities is a beautiful thing. And so a lot of people want to do that. I mean, growing up, for me, it was, I remember the day that the old Baptist church put a ramp to the front door for the elderly people. And it was
Mm-hmm.
this big deal. That
Mm-hmm.
ramp's still there today. And now I benefit from it when I go back there. It was a big deal. And that's just making a space so that people who have mobility issues can be included in the life of the church.
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually a better word that goes a step beyond inclusion. It was developed, I forget all the history of it, but I think it was first maybe used within the disability space by a gentleman named Eric Carter, who
Mm-hmm.
does excellent work. And you can find some of his articles online for those who want to dig into it. But he created this kind of spectrum or graph. I wish we could have images, but that showed kind of the progress from exclusion to, I forget all the words that he had. I could pull it up. But the last two kind of points on the spectrum of inclusion, I guess you could call it, was inclusion and then belonging. And what belonging does is it has all the benefits of inclusion. So we've built the ramp, we've got the disability ministry or whatever you want to call it. We've got a ramp on the stage so people can get in. We've included them. But belonging goes a step further because inclusion still kind of involves an us and them paradigm where the us who have no mobility issues, who have the power in the establishment, we are being benevolent to the people with mobility issues, the people who are usually on the outside, and it's out of the grace of our heart that we are including them. So it's an us and them moment.
Mm-hmm.
Belonging tears down the us and them, and it says it gives the opportunity for the people with the ability to make the changes. It gives them the opportunity to say, actually, I need you here.
Mm-hmm.
You're part of my family in Christ. And if I was having a meal around the table for my family and there was, for some reason, somebody couldn't get to the table, I would do whatever I could to make it so that they could get to the table because they belong. And if they're not here, well, I'm going to be deficient. So belonging includes like a felt, it includes, it says we need you. And actually, if you're not here, we have a felt deficiency because you bring something to the table that we need.
As part of my research, one of the things that I've encountered is discussions of, say, religious practices, making the distinction between what you're talking about, which is when we talk about, say, the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or
Hmm.
communion, however you want to call it, there are churches that will try to be accommodating for disabled
Hmm.
individuals by, say, moving the elements to them or something so that they can partake, but a lot of disability writers will say that that is one of the more isolating moments where you are set apart
Mm.
and distinguished and isolated from the rest of
Yeah,
the church community. That a special thing has to be made to, and in the way that you described the young man who was in the robot, it becomes
yeah,
a showcase. Look at how generous, benevolent,
that's right.
accepting we
Yep,
are.
yep.
It becomes a work of vanity in certain ways,
Hmm.
and so the idea of belonging, not just at the table, but you are a necessary contributor to the community at
Yeah.
large. That I think that's and I think that that is actually kind of useful in when we talk about questions of embodiment. So a lot of the things that I've been thinking about have been about the idea of embodiment or what we constitute as ourselves. And so
Hmm.
in a couple of your interviews, one of the things you mentioned was how the life that you've lived after your accident sort of has caused you to rethink what is you. And this sounds similar to some of the other
Mm,
discussions about that I've read in disability, namely how uh, your relationship with your wheelchair and how different access, different tools that we use to become mobile uh, become almost a part of us, right?
hmm
And so perhaps when we think about uh, those sort of things and trying to communicate with individuals who are able-bodied about what we understand ourselves to be,
hmm
that's a challenge often. And so
hmm
I don't know if you've experienced where, and so the prime example of this is, you know, people will actively move a chair without permission in a way
Yeah.
that if they touch you, if I'm touching you, I'm going to say, is it okay if I move you? And that happens frequently for individuals
Yeah.
who are, utilize wheelchairs. And so, if you could perhaps maybe discuss how your notion of the self and notion of yourself has changed in the past 14 years or so.
Yeah, for sure. There are others who could speak to this probably even better than I could. It's certainly something I've given thought to. I'll just give maybe one example. So if I'm going through a crowd or a tight space, my whole perception of space and size and momentum, all of it has fundamentally changed from what an able-bodied person is going to think. So, if I see a space, in a wheelchair, you're always thinking, can I get through that?
Hmm.
So if I see a space, I don't think of like just my body. My brain is rewired to the size of my wheelchair.
Hmm.
And it's just this intuitive, me in the wheelchair, but I can get through that. So what you'll hear a lot of is that the wheelchair or the walker or the whatever it happens to be feels more like an extension of the body or a part of your physical being than it is an external device that is you just happen to be sitting in or using. Another thing is, when I'm going down the street and when I'm with my friend who's an able-bodied walking beside me or with my wife, they're looking up and out more. I'm always, and I see up and out as well, but my brain and my intention is on down and forward because it is very important that I watch the slope and the grade. And it's very important that I keep an eye on like cracks and bumps. So, just as an example, between here and I don't know, the gym that I go to, which is, we'll just say, I'll just throw out a theoretical number, zero point 0.3 miles, I think is what my map says. It's not that
Yeah.
far. You can walk it in 10 or less minutes. But between here and there would be probably 100 things that if I hit wrong, I would be thrown from my wheelchair, right? But between here and there, I'm not going to have any issues. You know why? Because my brain is completely rewired to always, literally always, be looking down and forward, I don't know, down and in front of me because I'm making constantly little adjustments in my wheelchair to get through that space. And it's something that an able-bodied person would never even consider,
Yep.
you know?
Yep. Yep.
They have other considerations. But that's just a part of how the embodiment, like you're thinking walking and where's my foot gonna land? I'm thinking pushing, grade. Oh, I don't want to go up that side, I'll go up this side and it's constant
Mhm.
100% of the time.
Yep. And my guess is that a lot of the times when we talk about everything from sidewalks to buildings, a lot of the things have been designed with not the kind of evaluations that you take into account. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. In fact,
Yeah. We live in an able bodied world. It's
yep, yep,
just,
yep. The language I use is it's a world not made for us, and I
yeah.
think that's pretty fitting for things. And so like part of it is thinking about again, there has to be a realization, when we talk about any sort of 12-step problem, acknowledging that there's an issue. And this
hmm
acknowledgement of, yeah, members of a community or members of faith community or community at large are making assumptions, doing things, making decisions for uh, people
Yeah.
with disability if we and part of the things that we can do is talk about our own experiences. So, one of the things that I've heard in a couple of your videos, and I'll share my own experiences, is how um, uniquely, I'll say maybe not uniquely, but how sad some of the interactions that we've had with people. So before we started recording, I mentioned how at my own church, I was approached one day by an individual who said, I noticed that, again, no conversation, no idea who I am, no,
Oh
hi, who
yeah.
are you? Not that this has ever happened to either of us, right? But,
Right.
uh, I noticed that you're having problems with your neck. Is it stiff? Yeah, I've got this condition, yada, yada, yada. Give my memorized, recorded story that you're familiar with.
Mm,
And then, can I pray for you? Okay. And so I'm like, oh, okay, sure. And she comes back a week later and she says, how's your neck doing? Is it better? And I said, no, no, it's still the same. And you could just see her
yeah.
face fall. And this sort of, well, is she thinking that it's my faith that's faulty, or is it her faith that's faulty, or something? But I literally never saw her come back to the church. And so
Mm,
I wonder, in the back of my mind, it makes me wonder whether uh, that event was something that caused her to see it as a failure of that particular community or a failure in herself. But that's eaten at me for
yeah.
a while. And I know that from some of your talks, you've experienced similar practices, behaviors, mistreatments of disabled
Yeah.
individuals. Um, what have, you mentioned a few of these already. Um, what are some, we'll start with some negatives and then we'll work to maybe some positives. You mentioned the robot, you mentioned a few other things, but what have you seen in terms of faith community responses to disability? In terms of not just the physical accessibility, but the community
Mhm.
accessibility.
Yeah. Well, the one that you mentioned is the most pernicious, I think, right now, or among the most. It's birthed out of the theology of prosperity gospel,
Yeah.
um, faith and healing gospel. And what's interesting about my story is I actually was in that camp before my injury. So I was a part of that world and came into disability thinking everyone should be healed all the time. So I know very well kind of the logic of it all, the theological logic of it all. And that one's a big one. And I am still charismatic. So I love prayer and the power of prayer and the movement of the spirit. And I want to honor and respect those who um, believe in healing and out of the goodness of their heart want to reach out to the disabled community in the way that they do, with the love that they do. But for my fellow charismatic brothers and sisters, you need to know that when you're approaching someone to ask them to pray for you, or to ask if you can pray for them, and then especially if you ask if you can, because this is a common one, can I move your leg for you? Can I pray for you? Oh, try and move your leg. Try and move the thing that is disabled. That's very common,
Mhm.
and I get the logic of it because we're trying to operate in faith. It feels awkward. It feels hard. It's like I'm really putting myself out there as a person praying, but we're gonna operate in faith and we're gonna make a leap of faith. I get it. I really do. Um, but you need to understand that when you're doing that, you're entering into a relational dynamic with that person,
Mhm.
right? You have put yourself in a position of relationship that normally would be between two people who know each other's story, know each other's journey. You know how the person has processed their disability normally. But what you're doing in that moment is you're kind of jumping several steps in that relational dynamic.
Mhm.
You're jumping some steps and you're saying, I know what you need when it comes to your disability because I know what God says or the Bible says or theology says. And you're also jumping in between them and God and saying, and I know what God wants to say to you. What's actually happened is probably in a lot of cases is that this person has done a lot of processing with the Lord related to their disability and has come to certain theological and personal conclusions about their disability that might differ from yours, the person praying. So just you need to know you're entering into a relational dynamic that might include some of those things. So if you feel like you're called to that, just know that's what's happening. You also need to know that almost 100% of the time, if you're asking that person to move something or to try and move their leg, that person is going to feel extremely uncomfortable,
Yep.
incredibly uncomfortable.
Hmm.
So within this relational dynamic that you're creating by this interaction, you're not only jumping all of those steps, you're also asking this person to do an incredibly uncomfortable, exposing thing.
Hmm.
If you feel okay with doing that, then more power to you.
Yeah.
But you just need to know that that's what's happening.
Hmm.
Now, that said, I believe in miracles and I've seen miracles happen. That's just where I'm coming from. So I'm not saying 100% we don't need to be doing that. I'm just wanting you, the audience, to know that that's the dynamic you're entering into. So that's the big one.
Mhm.
I don't know if you have anything before I
No,
move
no,
on.
you went well. One of the things I really appreciated in the number of interviews that I've seen you give, and what you just said there was this idea of relation. And so, in a couple of the
Hmm.
interviews that you've had people say, "Well, how do we handle the word disabled?" And you've had other individuals say, when I'm coming to talk to you, do you want me to, get to eye level to discuss things with you?"
Hmm.
And a lot of these issues come from an earnest desire to assist or help people, but
Absolutely.
that jump of relation, that I would make the case that when we are dealing with individuals who are often ostracized, forgotten, separated, afterthoughts, objectified in
Hmm.
communities, and you are jumping the relationship aspect to know who they
Yep.
are. And so, the responses that you've given, I'm comfortable with using the word disability. This is something you've said. It's something I'm comfortable with. I'm comfortable with the word disability, but
Yep.
that's not universally an accepted term. And how do you know? You talk to the individual.
That's right.
You engage the
Yep.
individual. You learn what they like. You learn who they are. And I would make the case in the sort of situation that you described about moving a person and praying over a person for healing. There's a real danger of discussions of pride or
Yep.
vanity that comes into this.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the thing that I would linger on for a lot of that. And I would say even for the church at large,
Yep.
when we're in the case that you gave about the robot, look at what we're doing. Look at what we're doing.
Yep.
We're investing 10,000, we're investing $10,000 to
Yep.
show how accessible we are. And I think
Yeah.
that's a real danger that I see in a lot of communities. And so, yeah, I see that. I see that and again in a number of different circles. I see it in sort of individuals of a faith community approaching. I see it in
Yep.
the church at large. But as a means not to be a total Debbie Downer about things, what with the work that you're doing in the communities and the speaking engagements that you've had and the people that you've interacted with, um, are you have you noticed improvements? Have you in the work that you do? How do you lead communities to the sort of belonging that you were describing earlier?
Yeah. Well, I totally see progress made among the body of Christ. Just like any other issue, there are parts of the world that are going to be behind more in general, like the South, where I'm from, the
Mhm.
Bible Belt, where we're from. The rural church is going to be in general more behind,
Mhm.
and that's okay. We meet the person and the situation where we're at. But I'm seeing really a movement in the body of Christ of people becoming aware of their disabled neighbor that maybe has not been able to come to church, or maybe the disabled person in the congregation that's been coming for 20 years, but we realize we have actually not created a very accessible space for them. And
Mhm.
it's just like this illumination that's occurring. So I'm seeing a lot of churches that are seeing the problem and are excited and pumped to make changes.
Mhm.
And I love that. And they're doing it in a way that is more belonging centered than just inclusion centered.
Mhm.
So they want to, so a place of belonging is going to look more like people with disabilities are part of leadership if they're capable of doing so. If yeah, if they're if they have an intellectual developmental disability, maybe they can't be in certain leadership capacities, but man, we are pumped to have them as a greeter,
Mhm.
and not as like a tokenizing thing, not because, oh, we got to put a disabled person up there because we want to be inclusive and belonging. That's not what we're doing. They're part of the family, and man, they're going to greet way better and way different than I ever would. And I need them to do so, right? Some of the
Yep.
best greeters are individuals on the spectrum, right?
Yep.
Like they are going to love like you wouldn't believe,
Yep.
and they're going to create a space of joy that you wouldn't believe.
Yep.
So a place of belonging is going to look like that,
Hmm.
and we've got people with in their wheelchairs, not just in one little segregated place that, oh, look, we created a space for them. We're going to have spaces throughout the building where they can get, so that they're not segregated from their family or friends. There's going to be a ramp onto the stage because we believe that people with disabilities can lead the way and actually have something to say to us. Um, we are friends with people with disabilities. This is a big one. I started challenging people on this a few years ago, and I want to be gracious with it because I just bought a house and I know how hard it can be. But when you're thinking about a new home or renting a place, would you get a home that part of your family can't get into?
Right. Yep.
Well, I understand financial concerns for a lot of people, but I just want to make the plug. What if, when you're looking at homes, if you're able to, you only look at places that either have a ramp or have some kind of accessibility?
Mhm.
Because if you want to invite people to your table has to be accessible, right? And
In
I,
fact,
and I'm seeing churches do this.
mhm. And it's neat because you mentioned the accessibility in terms of the home. I just had a conversation with a dear friend of mine who is nearing retirement age, and
Hmm.
the very question about, you know, we moving to a place that had no steps. So this is something like thinking about that way isn't just something that was said in a couple of your talks is you have I'm gonna butcher the phrase here, but it's the able-bodied are only temporarily non-disabled. When we think
Hmm.
about this, a lot of the ideas about inclusivity and belonging, it also applies to individuals of certain age and as mobility slows down
Exactly.
too. And so
Exactly.
it's thinking about the entirety of the body there. And so they're thinking about our homes and our places of worship simultaneously. And so I appreciate that. One of the things that you mentioned in a couple of your talks was, you've already given us a story of the church that you were at the time of your injury, but then there was a mention, and I was hoping to flesh this out. You mentioned a sort of community of men or a men's group that you got
Hmm.
attached to, and that they were that they sort of helped you, elevated you, embraced you,
Hmm.
and I was a little dissatisfied because I wanted to hear more about that group and what
Yeah, sure.
particularly they did for you. And so, if we're talking about things to emulate for people, what was that group about, and what did they do for you that you
Yeah.
found helpful?
Yeah. Well, I'll frame it as what we did for each other. So imagine I think when I first went there, I was 19. So I'm 1.5, maybe years after my injury. I have been in a theology of faith and healing where everybody's supposed to be healed and prosperous. And I'm doing the things that I know to get my healing. Like that's part of that theological world. There are certain things that you do to get your healing. So I've got wrong theology. I don't really have great community because all the friends that I had are gone that I used to have, partly because I was 18 and people were moving on. So there's all these things. I don't really have a spiritual mentor at the time. Well, then through really a prophetic word and circumstances, I find myself in this men's group on a Monday night with this gem of a human being named David Gordon. And for those who, yeah, just so you know, like I'm in Portland, Oregon now, so I just moved. But all the way up until I moved, I was at David Gordon's house every Monday night for 13 years now.
Mm,
So that's how much of an impact it did. But imagine just a group of guys, and some of them when I first went were kind of ministry leaders, but it's changed over the years. Imagine a group of guys who are just normal, like they don't know a thing about disability, most of them. But what happened was I started coming into that space, and there was a moment created by me being there of proximity. This is a key word for us, between the able-bodied world and the disabled world there in this room. And what was happening was we were all doing the same thing. We were all taking our bad theology, or for David, he likes to talk about father wounds or emotional wounds that we bring into our faith. We're learning. I mean, we're learning all kinds of stuff. We're being pastored by David. We're being loved on by each other. We're all doing the same thing, right? I'm doing it in my wheelchair, and they're doing it, on their legs or whatever. And what's happened there is that the awkward barriers between able-bodied and disabled are being torn down. I'm in ministry, so over the years, I'm quite often doing pastoral care to some of these guys too. And what's created organically, like it didn't really happen because I went in and gave a talk. What's happened organically is that it became a place of belonging for all of us.
Mhm.
So that, like, we became deep. My best friends are a part of that group.
Mhm.
We hang out all the time. They come over to my house, I come over to their house. If I have a need, they're providing for that need, And David's house doesn't have a ramp on it, but
Mm.
and they were carrying me up and down steps. So what one of the guys did one day was like, he he was a lawnmower worker or something. He worked on lawnmowers or something like that, and he had these lawnmower ramps. He's like, in his thick redneck accent, I'm bringing some lawnmower ramps, and we're gonna make sure Cameron can get in. And this was
Mm.
years before I did any disability talks. I was just sharing my story places, and he got these ramps. All I'm trying to create is a scenario where the proximity between the disabled world and able-bodied world were brought together, and just organically, because this is what happens when you're in proximity with people who are different than you.
Mhm.
It became a space of belonging where we loved on each other back and forth. So I cared for their needs, they cared for my needs. We were all being pastored by David Gordon and others in the community, and it just became a space where we could be ourselves. And the wheelchair didn't disappear, but it just became part of the whole, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um,
It
and
actually, as you're
yeah, go ahead.
talking, one of the things that actually I was reminded of is like familial relationships. So you mentioned that you're newly married. I've been married 23 years,
Hmm.
and the sort of you know the person well enough to be able to respond appropriately
Yeah.
in the right way, the right time. In philosophy talk, this is phronesis, practical rationality,
Mm,
being able to. It's Kenny Rogers, the gambler, knowing when to hold them, when to fold them, when to
yeah,
walk away, and when to
sure.
run, right? But it requires awareness, attentiveness, authenticity, and just listening to the people in your community group realize that there is an accessibility issue and we're going to solve it because it's
Yeah.
important that you are with us in a way that you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
That is absolutely amazing. And again, I
And
think
imagine, if I can say, like, we we almost like started, so we created a space of belonging from just bare bones, nothing, just through experience. We created it, and now I'm able to be an active part of this community. And because I've been in ministry for 13 years, I bring a lot to that community. I'm not trying to be boastful. It's just the reality of it. I
Mhm.
lead some Monday nights. But we organically created that because we slowly saw the needs, and the needs, the barriers to access were slowly torn down, and it created a space where now everyone can contribute. Imagine if you have a church or small group, and they take care of those barriers of access on the front end. Imagine the wealth of possibilities that could just immediately open up to a
Mhm.
church if they were to do those things, um, and allow the disabled world full access. Anyway,
No,
just
no,
a
no.
thought.
In fact, this is one of the things that I actually think is kind of interesting because you mentioned like you leading sessions, you mentioned your
Hmm.
experience as a pastor and as a minister, and one of the things that I've really tried to repeatedly say in my discussions have been how the life that we live provides us insight and glimpses, and if we're talking theologically, glimpses of God that individuals who don't have our lived experiences are
Yeah.
unable of seeing. And so when I teach, and I teach at a state institution, but when I teach, I have a student who is deaf, and as part of our discussions with him, he has said in my bioethics classes, he said that you know he is aware that he's deaf, but his deafness has given him access to aspects of the world that individuals with hearing will never have access to.
Yep.
And I think that's something that's important to think about. And so maybe one thing to ask is what has your experiences given you that others who don't have your lived experiences might not be aware of? What is it? How has this enhanced your understanding of who God is? How has this enhanced your understanding of who you are? Uh,
Hmm.
how have you? I'm going to use the word improved, and if you don't like that word, I apologize. But how has this led you to a spot
Yeah.
that you are now?
Yeah. I mean, there's a range of directions that we could go with this. The first one, I'll just kind of do the more spiritual. This one was obvious early on, was this unique intimacy with the Lord that I got to experience being a space of total or being a space of much more dependence on Him in daily tasks. So everybody is dependent on the Lord. It's just we're not always as aware. But what disability does is it puts you in a space of keen, acute awareness of how needful you are of the Lord coming through on a daily basis. And what that did was it create I mean, it almost turned me Calvinist because I was like, God is literally coming through so many times through his sovereignty
Mhm,
that surely he is in control of every moment. Um, so you get to experience a unique intimacy with the Lord because he just likes to draw near to people who are suffering.
mhm,
It's something about his character that he wants to be near the vulnerable. He wants to be near people who are going through the hard things in life.
mhm,
So that's one bit. And it's not that I have a special relationship with the Lord. That's not what I'm saying. It's just something about who he is and the position of disability that yeah, you get to experience things in your faith that you may not have before. And I think there's a range of suffering that can cause that. The next thing that I'll mention, and this is something that we talk about at churches, is um, so in the modern world, especially in America, probably the idea of dependence on someone is really anathema. Like the goal in life, kind of the unspoken goal in life, is I want to get to a place where I don't depend on anybody,
yep,
and that's kind of the ethos that we're trying for. What you learn in disability is that actually dependence and interdependence is actually a space where you get to experience a beautiful form of life
mhm,
and a beautiful relational connection and dynamic with people that you might not get on a regular basis before. So I think it tears down the idea that the highest goal is dependence or is independence.
mhm,
So dependence and interdependence, I actually think is a Christian ethic that gets lost in the Western church, but that disability can bring back to a church and say, actually, hey, I have a beautiful life. It's tough sometimes, but I have a beautiful life and I'm very dependent on people. And actually, I contribute a lot to this body as a person who has great needs that others have to fill,
mhm.
you know?
No, no, no. It reminds me like that whole idea, what you're describing of the importance of dependence of being close to God. My mind immediately goes back to my own issues with my Crohn's disease, and I spent a week in the hospital after my intestinal resectioning.
Mm,
And that first couple of days when you're strapped to IVs and all sorts of tubes coming out of all various parts of your body, and you realize how utterly helpless you are in a lot
yeah,
of ways, and you are forced to push the nurse call button, and you are forced to be
yeah,
vulnerable, and you realize how vulnerable people really are.
yeah,
And that's something that was still and crying out to God at 3 in the morning
yeah.
as I'm dealing with the complications tied to my Crohn's.
Hmm.
It is something that, so your description is something that I've experienced too. I think that for me, one of the things that I found also is that it creates my situation creates a cultural, an aware, uh, mm, I won't say I'm not perfect in any standard, but it creates an ability to possibly become more aware of individuals who are living similar journeys. And so
Hmm.
a lot of my work in the classroom now deals with accessibility for individuals who are on the spectrum or have learning
Yep.
disabilities and the like. And so I would not have had that awareness had it not been for my own disability journey. And so
Yeah.
and I think that it gives insight. It helps me, hopefully, Lord willing, help other people too. And so,
Yep.
but I don't want to take. I value your time, and I know that for the project we're working on, we're trying to keep these conversations to about an hour. So as a way to, but thank you so much for this.
Oh, for
This has
sure.
been so wonderfully affirming, and it's been an encouragement to me because a lot of the like I feel like when it comes to discussing disability, at times it feels like we're a little bit in the wilderness whenever we're talking to faith communities about this.
Hmm.
And so being with somebody who, again, as I was preparing for this, listening to your interviews, listening to your conversation today, I'm as much as I am physically able to nod, I'm nodding along with it as I go through. It looks a little bit like I'm headbanging, but I'm nodding along. But um,
I
as,
loved your headbangs. They're affirming.
but as a way to sort of close us out, what would you if there's something that can be a last impression, an opportunity to leave people who listen to this with, what would you want to leave listeners with today?
Yeah, there's several things that I could say, but I think the one that I would say, I've already kind of hinted at it, but a big ethos that we're learning in Accessible Grace, the ministry that we're building, is that proximity is such a key game changer when it comes to disability. Because a lot of times when we want to do good things for the disabled world, um, we still do it at a place of distance. We can do ministry at a distance and feel good about ourselves, but still be missing the mark. What
Mm,
actually happens when you have proximity to people with disabilities, as scary as that could seem at first, as awkward as that could seem at first, is when you have proximity to it, you realize that you actually are having proximity to a life-changing relationship, that these people actually bring something to the table and bring something to your life that is life-changing and beautiful. I just went to Catherine Wolfe. She's a wonderful speaker, human being. Her ministry, Hope Heals. She has Hope Heals Camp, and my wife and I got to go and just be members at the camp, like we get to experience the camp. And the proximity to disability was even greater than I normally experience. And we left just so alive and so full of joy and so tearful from just the ways that God worked in our hearts because of proximity to disability of all ranges. It really is. There's something special about the heart of God when it comes to people with disabilities. And I would just say if there are barriers to you having proximity with people with disabilities, then I would try and tear down those barriers and create access for yourself to have proximity with the world of disability. So,
mm. And I would say that when we talk about those barriers may be physical, those barriers may be emotional. Like you don't know what you're
yep.
afraid of saying the right thing or insulting somebody. You
Hmm.
might be it might be cultural, or it might be
Cultural barriers for sure.
or even practices within the church
Hmm.
community, that being aware of the things that keep us from community, from
Yep.
integration, from proximity, from closeness, from community, authentic
Yep.
community, is something that we need to toss right out. We need
Hmm.
we need to be the church, and the church is holistic, the whole body.
Yep.
But anyway, Cameron, thank you so much for this time. It was so affirming to me. I really appreciate you. I appreciate your ministry, and we'll make sure
Yeah.
that whenever we do whatever it is we're doing, we include the links to the website, to some of the other stories, because again, I would strongly encourage anybody listening to this, watch Cameron's discussions. The videos were caused a lot of questions, and good
Mm.
questions, good philosopher questions, and they were the kind of thing that were well worth the time to think about. But Cameron, thank you so much.
John, thank you so much for doing that interview with Cameron. I really enjoyed listening to it, and also really enjoy both of you sharing your experiences and just this thing that you're both very passionate about.
It was a wonderful experience, just to, there are these moments where you spend with individuals and know that there's some elements of commonality between the things that you've experienced, and just being able to, I can't do it physically, but proverbially nod along as a person relays their own story. Yeah, so it was a very enriching experience for me as well. So,
And I think it's so important. We start out the book, True Images, but also this podcast with kind of laying this foundation of this understanding and a really robust understanding that we are embodied souls and what that actually entails and what that means. So I think to have that conversation started by two people who experience disability in a physical way, it really helps us see it not only just from a different perspective, but see just a more full version of what that means. Because if we don't have a solid understanding of what it means to be an embodied soul, what it means to be a living image of God, that will change how we operate in community, but also really deeply affect our theology in a negative way.
Indubitably, Socrates, it must be thus.
I think, too, it's a really good start to this conversation to be thinking about inherent value, because that's a really big crux of why all of this matters. Like when we talk about the commercial sex industry, when we talk about sexuality and God's design for it and all of these things, to understand what that means, and also to understand that human value is a part of being an embodied soul, and this human value and worth that doesn't get depleted or diminished or taken away. And I think that's, part of the reason why both porn culture and purity culture and all of these things really deplete and diminish that understanding of value, because they make it seem like value is something that either you earn through your sexuality or can be taken away from you through those things. And to have a conversation about value, but also belonging, not just inclusion, but belonging, that's really good groundwork to lay while we start this.
I think one of the things that might be worth considering again is where we draw value. And so one of the things that Cameron mentioned as part of the interview was how, in his speaking engagements, in his efforts with disability and accessibility, there is an underlying, understated, assumed nature of the very space that we're in right now. And that's not just religious space, that's literally every space that we're in, that we assume certain elements of mobility, certain elements of communication, certain elements of mobility and space, and that is not universally the case. And so we have a long human tradition of devaluing individuals who do not fit the sort of expectation or normalcy that we see across a large portion of the population. So whether it's something like this in a room that is not built for somebody with Crohn's in terms of like accessibility to leaving the restroom, or to the space that we have in religious communities where individuals have to be asked to get a ramp to the area. It's something that we don't realize. It's so embedded in our activity. This I think is where purity culture and where a lot of sexual discussions come in. The worth is so embedded in our normal cultural practices that we aren't even aware that it's happening until we're drawing attention to it. And I think that's one of the things that's useful for, say, discussions of embodiment, discussions of disability and philosophy, even if you yourself aren't directly impacted by some of the things that Cameron and I were talking about.
I think too, like one thing that I've encountered, and part of this is based on kind of the tradition that I grew up in and the culture there, but is just when it comes to the body, it was almost imported into my Christian worldview that you could do things with your body to decrease your value. And I think with purity culture, that's kind of the thought too, is you become something that's no longer usable, but there's a separation. It's the soul is something spiritual and the body is something that can impact it, but it's not seen as the whole package. And that's something where even over the last few years, I think that I've been learning more in that area, just how I believe God made us to be, again, a soul. A soul is more than just the ethereal component. Like a soul is us, as the whole person. So when we're talking about disability, we're talking about porn culture, we have to realize that us, we are what's valuable. We are representatives of God, made in God's image as a whole person. And I think when we start segment that out, that's when we get into a lot of trouble. When people, we see people as having different value inherently. And I mean, that's something that I've been growing in a lot lately, but that's a valuable thing.
I think for me, looking at this transactional view of people, and I think that's just a part of, we're talking about culture, and looking at it from the standpoint of with the sex industry, is that what can you provide for me? And we don't necessarily think about that when it comes to the church or even in everyday life. But you see people with inherent worth. I think that's a part of, honestly, just this is all anecdotal. I don't have any research behind it right now. But the idea of our culture highly valuing product, what you give, what you get, and how much does it cost. But I even saw that even in church, and how even leadership talked about new people coming into the church. Oh, they could play this, or they could do this, or are they a drain to the resources or not? And hearing those conversations from church leaders also, I'm like, this is permeated not just our culture of the world, but also in the church. And that was something that I just saw, like, where does that worth come from? And it should be inherent from the Lord, from God in our soul. But again, we put dollar signs, metaphorical dollar signs, even on people, I think.
Well, I think so again, if you guys have to stop me if I go too far down the philosophical rabbit hole, okay?
Go down.
But I think that part of it is that it's tied to the very words that we use. And so there's a philosopher, an American pragmatist by the name of Richard Rorty, and he has this piece called Looking Backward from 2096. And he references a lot of John Steinbeck. And Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath mentions this idea of like shared community, and a word that is repeatedly used is fraternity or familialness, being family with each other. And the problem is that when we talk about all facets, so Rorty's case is that when we talk about all facets of human beings, we often talk about the things that were expected or owed to us, and we use the language of rights, right? So we say that we have inevitable, inalienable human rights. But the language of rights is a language of possession. Even the very words that I use, I have rights, it becomes a discussion of exchange. And instead, Rorty suggests that by thinking it in terms of fraternity or brotherhood, you foundationally shift the discussion. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, you look at Christianity, you look at the early church, you look at Acts, all the way up to like Acts 5, you have a community of people that are not seeing each other as commodities, which Kant says, human beings have a dignity, they don't have a price, we can't treat them as commodities. But you have them treating them as family. And when you think about, both of you have mentioned the children that you have, when you think about your kids, you don't necessarily think about the economic drain, which of course all of them are. You don't think about the economic drains, you think about who they are inherently as people. And so it's not like the very language of possession, the very words we use shape this. And so the discussion about purity culture, again, it's a language of exchange, right? I have, when we talk about sexual intercourse, I have taken somebody's something. I have maintained my purity. It becomes economic. It becomes exchange. And then there is an inherent devaluing. But when we talk about it in terms of familialness or fraternity, of relation, it shapes and shifts the discussion as a whole.
I think that's one of the things, even your interview with Cameron kind of touched on this in the sense of belonging. And later on, he was talking about having a home that's accessible where you can invite anyone to the table and where anyone's welcome, and kind of also comparing a church community to that type of environment. But I think when our thinking shifts and we see people as family and not commodity, hopefully that's the journey that we're on. And so we're seeing everyone as someone who is welcome at our table and welcome before us, not just by what we've done. And you were talking about product. We view people as product. Then we're attaching dollar signs to them. And I think the flip side of that coin is some people we see as more valuable, and then other people we see as less valuable, right? Is the other side of the coin where we're devaluing people and thinking, well, this person, just like some products we consume, we don't have much value behind that. I mean, I'll take a lot of, one-time use products and I use it and then I toss it away and I don't think twice about it again. But when we start to view people that way, it's really dangerous. But family, seeing people as like us in that sense, as worthy, as having belonging, like that really shifts our perspective no matter what or whom that person is. So
I think it also helps so much in this conversation as well, even in terms of value by productivity, when you start to actually understand from like a biblical perspective what human beings are created for, because even if you turn that into a productivity thing, then it excludes a lot of people. It excludes even children or older people or when you're sick or, not to mention a whole community of people who experience disability mentally or physically. But I think it also helps us understand why, or I guess the different ways that when we misuse other people, like when we treat them in a way that they weren't intended to be treated, we're not giving them the dignity or respect that they deserve, how much more that's going to impact them and influence them because it's not what they were created for or designed for. And so when we use people or treat them like objects, or I guess even just to understand like the things that happen to you as an embodied soul are going to impact you, I think it just gives us a little bit more perspective to understand that. Because purity culture and porn culture both, they kind of make us seem like disembodied beings, and that you can maybe have, even in terms of like sexual abuse or these things that are being depicted through pornography, or I think even with purity culture, it's like, it only matters what I do with my body. The rest of it doesn't matter. It just technically matters what I technically do in this space. And then we forget that actually the things that we do affect us deeply. And when, in terms of porn, when you dehumanize another human being in such aggressive and violent ways, it's going to impact them. And that's why I think so many times you'll hear people talk about their experiences as maybe like an OnlyFans model or someone who's working on a porn set, or even just yesterday I was talking to someone who was sharing their experiences with hookup culture and was just saying it was like inextricable from alcohol and substance use, because sometimes you just have to numb yourself out when people treat you like an object.
And as somebody who is not as well versed in some of the discussions that you are, I, as you're discussing this, my mind immediately goes to some of my own experiences about how a person's value and self-worth tie into, how it impacts who they are and how they feel about themselves. And so as an instructor, and I know we have teachers, every one of us in some way, shape, or form is a teacher, we've encountered students who have really had an difficult vision of themselves, either through the lens of purity culture, where I have had these things happen to me in the past, and so now I'm no longer good enough, or students who are struggling with a subject or can't get a design program right, or are trying to run a program where they haven't provided a license for it and so have to spend 20 minutes getting everything together. Not that that's happening anywhere. But part of it, I was approached this semester, I'm teaching a very difficult subject material in one of my classes, and I was approaching a student who was just really struggling, and they were nearly in tears, and, they were just, you could hear them audibly just start attacking themselves. And I stopped them and I said, you understand that I'm going to be gracious in the way that I grade, that I do not see your grade as a value of who you are. Why are you being harder on yourself than what I'm going to be? I'm the expert in the field, and I'm being gracious. Why will you not let yourself be gracious in a way that I'm being gracious to you? And her eyes sort of opened up, and she said, you're right. And so I think this sort of difficulty that you were discussing about how we perceive ourselves, whether it be through hookup culture or even the very way that we take classes, there are so many different ways that we can not see ourselves or incorrectly see ourselves. And we just have to be aware of needing to find the right set of glasses, so to speak, as the only person in the room right now with glasses on. But
I think too, just realizing that all of us, one thing that I've, been learning as well lately is we're all kind of a mixture of good and bad. We all have decisions that we regret. We all have decisions that we're proud of, and we look back and we would make the same decision every single time if given the same opportunity. And so I guess learning, like John said, to be gracious toward ourselves and then toward other people as well. I think what I've seen come into Christianity in some circles as well is maybe a little bit of pride and hypocrisy, because we look at something other people have done and we look down on them maybe for something they've done with their body, for example, but yet we don't see what we've done or not done with our own bodies or with our decisions or our choices. And so to not give other people the freedom to make mistakes or to not know things or to have different experiences than we do, quite honestly, and maybe those experiences somebody would look down on and then other people would not. But it's just it's more complicated, and I think we all have to be honest with ourselves, and a starting point of humility is really helpful for these discussions, but it's also helpful for us when we look at choices other people make.
In my context today, I work with K through 7th during the day, and there was a student that part of what I do is I have to redirect and refocus some of these kids back to getting back into the lesson or just stopping them from fighting. Very simple stuff, but I had a student today that was very hard on himself. He was like, I'm never going to be able to do this. I can't do this. I'm not good enough to do this. And just sat, in the context of a public school, the conversation you have is a little bit different, but encouraged, like, we're here in a school, and that same humble idea is like, we're all learning, we're all growing. And the student started like hitting themselves, like, I can't do it. I can't be good. I'm like, that's why I'm here. We're here to help you. That's why we're here to direct you as teachers. And seeing that same patience that I had for this young child, sometimes I didn't have that same patience for people in the church. Like, even as a pastor for 16 years at the church I was at, and when someone messed up, I'm like, oh, you're done. and many times it was modeled for me, like, if you've messed up, then you're done. And I was like, is that the grace that we want to share with people? And really, Cameron, the ministry that it was accessible grace,
Yep.
and providing that access, being the one as a pastor. And I kept thinking, in the context of allowing people to be a part, and something that he said in the interview, that churches should be places of accessible grace, and this idea of letting, not letting them, they were making decisions for disability and for accessibility, but not talking to anyone in that space. I was like, that's crazy. And then I was like, oh, I remember being in meetings where we did the same thing, making decisions for people, for ministry things, with not having those people in the room.
So, but here's the thing, Ivan, and this is the big issue, is that we could sub out disability for other groups,
Yep.
and we end up with that same discussion.
Yeah.
So we could insert women
Yep.
into this discussion. We could insert the elderly, we could insert children
Yep.
into any of that sort of group. And I think that, one of the things that has been discussed pretty extensively in our discussion so far, discussion, sorry, that's bad podcast stuff, was this idea of, this sort of categorization, right? Pure, impure, mind, body, the sort of dualism. I think one of the reasons is that we are inherently a species that separates and divides, because separation and division creates, to a certain extent, stability, and there's an evolutionary benefit to it. So if I'm seeing a group that I don't know if they're threatening or not, I can distinguish between us and them. And so if they are threatening, then I preserve myself, I preserve my community by making that distinction, that it is human nature to divide into elements of us and them. And the us can be tied to skin tone, it can be tied to religious ideology, it can be tied to virtue checks. In order to be pure, you have to be this. In order to be a pastor, you have to make sure you can't have tattoos, because if you have tattoos, then you can't be a pastor. You can married, the whole discussion, all these benchmarks of division for the purposes of creating a zone that we feel is righteous, set aside, set apart, that I think boils down to pride and self-preservation. And so I think that, again, the danger in all this discussion is while my interview was about disability, the nice thing is that it touches on all elements of division that exists in the church community or the community at large. Not going to get into politics here, but we could talk about divisions that occur in those spaces as well. That it is human, it is evolutionary, it is something that is also showing us our broken nature as humans.
One thing that I appreciated too, that I think helps kind of bridge the gap from your interview with Cameron, was proximity. That's something that I've found in our relationships that we have with people. So my wife and I, we have a lot of close friendships with people who think very differently. We even had a meal last night with some neighbors who think differently in some ways. And it was interesting to sit down and try to understand their perspectives on different issues. And then in other areas, we discover we think the same. And but we have friends, lots of friends who are not religious people at all. And that's different from me. I'm a pastor at a church. And so immediately there's some perceived differences that are there. But as we get into closer proximity, we realize, one, we have a lot of similarities. Two, there are some very good things about these people who are very different from us. Three, we have a lot of things to learn. And Cameron touched on how even his friends in this Monday night group that he met with, they learned that he had some things to bring to the table and to give and to contribute. And then also they learned that they had some things to give and to contribute. And I think when we come into close proximity with people that we perceive as very different from us, that really helps break down some of the stereotypes and honestly some of the fears that drive our society in so many different ways today. And I think even, let's say we have a friend who's a model for OnlyFans, or a friend who is a survivor of abuse, and we come into close proximity, we just gain understanding, and there's an acceptance that's there and a belonging that starts to form. And that's really a great starting point for us, because we're different from a lot of people. All of us are. We have differences, but when we come together, proximity is very, very healing.
I think one of the things that's helped me the most in this conversation, especially about sexuality and the topics that we're focusing on, is understanding purity, not just as virginity, definitely, but even just to understand it as to be, this is Bible Project language, but to be made spiritually whole. And I think that helps us understand when we're making community with other people, when we're in community, I should say, we understand as Jesus followers, like when we're coming to other people, we're not saying, I used to be dirty and now I'm clean. We are cleansed by Jesus, but I'm just saying it's not like I'm saying I used to be like you and now I'm superior because of this. It's saying I'm a broken person and I've been broken by my sin and I've been broken by all these things, and Jesus offers me this opportunity to become whole. And part of the, design part of this, of like what it actually means to actually truly be a human and to invite other people into wholeness and healing, and not this superiority thing where I'm reaching down to you, but both of us are together walking towards Jesus with one another.
But again, that pride element, again, as somebody who is part of the disabled community, that pride element is so pervasive in everything that we do that we are not even aware that we are doing it until it is brought to our attention.
Yep.
It's the individual who approaches me to pray over my neck or offer me a solution, all of those things. It's the individual who looks down upon a person once they find out their story and their lived experiences and say, well, at least I'm not this. And again, we create those sort of stereotypes of a person who hears the story of a survivor and says, well, at least I'm not that person. But as somebody who regularly works with neurodivergent individuals, who has a neurodivergent child, who works regularly with disability, there are a lot of people in their lived experiences who will say things like, I'm glad I don't have to do X, which is your life. So people will say, how do you drive? Very well, thank you. How do you put up with this? Very well, thank you. That what you consider to be this big major thing is a Tuesday for me. And I think that's the idea of division, of human pride saying that I am better because I am X, is so grounded in our community expectations that we are told that it's how you, again, even looking at notions of success. In order to be success, you have to be better than these people. And I don't keep flashing over that hand. I'm not pointing in your direction. It's just these people.
It's you.
It's you. But it is a way to elevate ourselves. It boils down to we want to be like God. We want to be elevated. And stepping on Ivan and his tattoos is a way for me to feel superior for that very moment, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that it just, in many ways, just boils down to pride.
I was, meditating on just the word when he said proximity, and I just taught on this a little while ago, like that we need to be incarnate with people. As Jesus made flesh, and dwelt among us, that we would do that with people, and that's something that I had a hard time with coming out of growing up in church. I'm like, oh, I don't want to stumble myself. I was like, yeah, that's a good thing, but I was making myself this Pharisee that I am clean, you're not, separation, kind of what we were talking about earlier. And this idea of proximity, to be close, to enter into, be incarnate, to let people see that you're there with them. And I shared this with our church a little while back, is are you a curb or a ramp? And a curb is a division from road to sidewalk, but a ramp is an access onto that place. And so I was like, you guys are curbs or are you ramps? And that's my prayer. That's my desire, is that I would be a ramp. But many times I was a curb, and people got curb stomped on it. And sorry. And I was something I needed to grow. And I was like, this division is holy. But, when we reframe what it means to be set apart, it's not being set apart from people. It's to be set apart for Jesus, for God's glory, for what God wants to do in our life. And that idea of bringing people in, that really resonated with me. Like, ask those questions. Let people see that you want to know those answers rather than assuming. And I did that a lot of my ministry life, and I'm learning and I'm growing, and I pray that I would ask more questions rather than make statements, and I would be a curb for people.
I just had a fantastic interview with Mo Isam yesterday, and we'll share the interview. It's like one of the best. Really, she preached like a sermon, and it was like the best sermon I've ever heard. It was so fantastic. And I won't dive too much into this because she'll tell the whole story, but she was talking about being I think she was in the UK somewhere. She was at a church, and this woman who was trafficking other people who had been involved in the industry as a madam for like 20 years was coming to her and asking her after this talk that she gave, like, how do I come to Jesus? I'm so broken. I don't think he can save me. And she was like, well, what is it that you think is separating you from Jesus? And she explained, I'm a madam. And she was saying, like, I don't understand what the big deal is, like, come to Jesus, because I like, there's nothing that's going to keep you from him and his forgiveness, but also you're imagining that your brokenness or these things that you've done or even that have happened to you are somehow changing that value, but also just changing you as a person, and somehow you're not going to be accepted or invited into this community. And she was just, the way that she explained the story is so fantastic, and just the leaps and bounds that this woman has taken to now, empower and elevate and value other human beings. But I think I'm just so excited that we're having this conversation. This is such a good conversation, and I'm so glad that we got to hear this interview with John and Cameron. It's so fantastic.
I'm looking at the timer, and I know we're cutting some things out. So, but yeah, it was a wonderful opportunity for me. And again, I would say that, you know, if we're thinking about ways to sort of ebb the conversation to a close, I think that, you know, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on our own actions and how we perceive ourselves. On one hand, it's the student that I mentioned earlier. We're so harsh on ourselves that we don't understand that we are capable of receiving grace. Why are we judging ourselves harder than the God that came to us? And on the other hand, it also forces us to be in that situation that Ivan was talking about, where we're asked to think about what our own assumptions are. How do we treat people? How do we perceive ourselves and the world around us? That it is a chance to reflect about our assumptions, about who we are, and about whose we are.
I think, too, that our identity is not the things that we have done. I've heard stories about people who, I guess in America, it's common for people to tell what they do for their career as far as what defines them. And if we look at our actions as what defines us, I think if we look especially at the early pages of Genesis, we find a whole different definition of how God sees us and how God defines us based on who we are as his image bearers and the responsibilities he's given us as humanity, not just the things that we've done.
And two, I think when we're able to start this conversation with you're created with value, not the, you know, the sin that we've created, it really changes it as well, because it gives us a vision, I think, really for the new creation and that becoming whole again, and what, you know, going back to the thing that we were designed for. Well, I'm really so excited to start the podcast on this conversation and this note, and I'm excited to see you guys next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.